the session's going to go. So Gawain will give us his contribution, and obviously he'll have to leave, but he'll be listening in because he's got to go back on a train up here. So he'll be listening in. But the idea is that once Gawain's made his contribution, we'll open up to the floor. Sophia, who's one of the UCU Edinburgh branch co-presidents, is going to make an initial response because she's done a lot of reading in the book, and then that'll hopefully kind of set up the discussion for everybody. But we want it to be open, but the key is to try to think about what do we do now as a result of the kind of circumstances we're in. So without further ado, Gawain, I'm going to hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. And thanks very much for that very generous introduction, Stuart. It really is a pleasure and an honour to speak to, and an honour to be speaking, albeit virtually at the moment, in the place where Terry Wrigley was working, was a staff member, someone I had a huge amount of respect for and worked very closely with on a number of campaigns. And I think he'd be really pleased that this meeting is being put on. My apologies that I'm not there physically. I'm currently on North Allerton train station, so occasionally you may hear a train go past. I'll pause, but if it's not too disruptive, hopefully that will be fine. That is a disappointment, but I will make it to Edinburgh this evening. Unfortunately, the trains have been absolutely awful, but I like to think there's one advantage to this. We often say in meetings of this type that once we've had the opening, we'd really like to get into proper discussion rather than just questions to the speaker. And the fact that when we move into the discussion, I'll be hopping on the train and my reception might be intermittent, will really put the discussion in your hands. So maybe we can look on that as a positive. But I'd like to begin really where Stuart stops in his introductory remarks, talking about the challenges that the labour movement faces at the moment, because I think we have to be honest about the challenges we face. Yes, we have to have hope, we have to have that optimism of the will, but it means nothing if we don't start from the pessimism of the intellect, from understanding the real situation we face. And the fact is that the trade union movement in this country is in significant crisis. It's a deep set crisis and a long crisis. As we say in the book, 2018 recorded the lowest number of people involved in strike action, and the lowest number of stoppages taking place, or the second lowest number of stoppages taking place since records began. A trade union movement that was very much on the back foot. Now, we've seen some changes in that over the past 5 years, but nevertheless, that legacy, that 40 years of a trade union movement in decline and on the back foot, I think is a really significant starting point for the book. What we were trying to do was look within that and say, well, what are the opportunities for change? What are the opportunities to turn this picture around? Over the last 5 years since we started writing the book, that position from 2018 has changed dramatically with the strike action we've seen from rail workers, from postal workers, from educators, from health workers, a huge range of different people right across the economy taking strike action. And yet in 2022, the last year for which statistics are available, the trade union movement, in spite of the beginning of that strike wave, the trade union movement lost 200,000 members. The majority, around 2/3 of them, women working in the private sector. So we shouldn't neglect the significant challenges that we face as a movement. What we set out to do in the book was explore the journey of one union in trying to face up to those challenges over a 10-year period. We look at a decade of organising in the National Education Union and one of its predecessors, the NUT. And we try and explore what lessons that may have for the movement more broadly, both through the successes that that union undeniably has had over that period, but also through the difficulties, through the challenges it's faced, through the mistakes that it's made. So we think it's a fairly honest account of that process. As I say, we explore a 10-year period of a single union, and it is a case study of a single union and one of its predecessors. So they're only contributions to a discussion. They certainly aren't answers. And in one sense, the title, I don't even think of them as lessons. They're more starting points for discussion and a contribution to where the movement goes and how we respond to the challenges that we face. in spite of that, there were several reasons that we felt that the example of the NEU and its predecessor, the NUT, were worth exploring. Certain reasons we felt that those were particularly worth exploring. One of those is that it was one of the few unions that during the period we were looking at, particularly in recent years, had bucked the trend of declining membership within the trade union movement and had grown year on year. Another reason was some of the successes that had been secured during the pandemic. And right near the opening of the book, we tell the story of what happened in January 2021. If people think back to that time, the end of 2020, a new strain of COVID had been identified. It had started to spread and people were once again getting significantly ill. The kind of centre of it, I guess, was in London. And a number of London boroughs decided to close their schools a week early for the Christmas break at the end of 2020 in order to prevent the spread of the new strain of COVID. The DfE actually took those local authorities to court to force the schools to stay open because their position was that education had to stay open, and successfully, and in doing so, caused a further spread of that new variant of COVID. We then headed into a Christmas period where things became more and more difficult. The virus became more and more virulent. And as we hit the beginning of 2021, the government announced that all schools, all primary schools, would be open from the 4th of January, from the first day of the term. The Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, went live on air to say that schools were perfectly safe, they would all be open, and every parent should send their primary age children in. The union identified this as a significant risk to health, a risk to those people working in schools, but also a risk to the families and communities that those schools served. And so on the Saturday before the schools were due to reopen on the Monday, an emergency meeting of the National Executive was called. That meeting lasted 2 hours and had significant debate, but its decision was to unanimously recommend that schools were unsafe to enter and advise all members of the NEU not to return to work on Monday. On the Sunday, an online trade union meeting was called, attended by 400,000 people online. We believe it's the biggest trade union meeting ever recorded in history. 400,000 people attended and the word spread significantly. People were advised to write individual letters using Section 44 of the Trade Union Labour Relations Act in order to express to their employers that they were not willing to enter an unsafe workplace. Those letters went out, and the following day on Monday, when the government had declared that schools would be open, the vast majority of schools in the country didn't open. Some 80 or 90% of schools did not open because staff weren't there to open them. And that evening, 8 p.m, Boris Johnson went back on live TV and said that the government had decided that schools were vectors for the transmission of COVID and would all be closed because the government wanted to keep people safe. That was one of a number of times where the NEU was able to force the government into complete U-turns. And when I say the NEU, I don't mean the NEU leadership through some clever plans. I don't mean that it was simply, but the NEU members general, because the reality was for that action that although it was the National Executive that made the call, that issued the advice, it rested on the mass action of thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of teachers up and down the country to take that action. That put power in the hands of members at the base of the union, but it relied on what we argue in the book was 10 years of careful work of organising to put members into a position where they would be willing to take that action, 48 hours notice, without a ballot, etc., to simply close down the entire school system in order to keep families and communities safe. It's one example of what we think had created quite possibly a unique position within the trade union movement of being able to effectively mobilise that scale of action amongst members at a moment's notice. So we wanted to explore how that had been possible, looking back at a union that if you went 10, 5, or even a couple of years earlier, wouldn't have been able to deliver a result of that nature. The book starts by exploring the context that unions have faced over the last 40 years, and we identify this constant challenge, this constant struggle with an attempt to restructure the economy, the education system, our social services along neoliberal lines. Now, this won't be unfamiliar, I'm sure, to UCU members and to others. What we've seen in terms of the changes since the late 1970s in this country, the restructuring of our entire society, the fragmentation of public services, the forcing down of both the social wage and people's take-home pay, the breaking of the power of labour has been just absolutely disastrous for the working class. The balance of power has shifted dramatically. We looked at the position of unions within that. And I guess the argument we make is that in that process of restructuring, unions are faced with essentially three options. Either they can follow a path of rapprochement, they can go with the direction of travel, they can accept that this is the policy direction, this is what's happening, and their role as trade unions is simply to protect their members within that process, handhold through redundancy, make sure people get the best possible packages, but ultimately we won't change the direction of travel. Secondly, they could choose the path of resistance, that as unions, what they'll do is they'll use the power, every bit of strength they have, to try and fight each initiative as it comes, to try and push back, to try and slow the tide of change, and ultimately to try and reverse it. And this is what a number of unions did, and we look at that in the book, drawing on an earlier bit of work by Bob Carter, Howard Stevenson, and Rowan Apache. We look at that resistance, but we also look at its limitations and the fact that actually unions resisting on the basis of the resisting strength, what was happening became very much a reactive and a defensive struggle, in that each time unions were calling more and more strike action, but fewer and fewer people were taking part. And instead of building power and developing the power of those unions to resist the change, what was happening was it was in fact weakening the power of unions to resist change. So we then look at a third option, that of renewal, that unions can combine their resistance to what was happening in education and in the rest of society, in the economy, combine that with trying to renew their own structures, renew their own base, their own membership base, and to reconnect the union from top to bottom. And I'll give an example of what we meant by that renewal process. And it was one of our kind of starting points for the discussions that happened with NUT and NEU. The fragmentation of schools, of education, meant that where previously pay was determined at a national level from 1919 onwards through national collective bargaining, following the defeat of the 84 to 86 teachers' strike in 1987, the government imposed a pay review body, but nevertheless at a national level those decisions were taken. Most other terms and conditions were decided at a local authority level. With the fragmentation of schools, academisation, the breakup of the state education system in England in particular, what we saw was those decisions that had been taken by negotiators at national or local authority level were being bounced down by the employer to workplace level. Individual schools from 2013 onwards in England could set their own pay policies, whether they were academies or not. They would set their own pay scales. They had complete devolution of pay to an individual workplace level. Now, of course, this was an attack on the collective bargaining rights of teachers. It was an attack on their terms and conditions, but at the same time, it provided a massive opportunity for renewal, because the vast majority of members had been completely insulated from the process of negotiating terms and conditions, of pushing back on them. It was something that happened elsewhere, nationally, in government, in Westminster, or at local authority level. Suddenly, that was being put right in front of their eyes, decided at a workplace level, and it was up to them organising their workplace groups to push back against it. And this, we identified, if the union took the challenge on correctly, provided an opportunity to renew the democratic basis of the union, to renew the structures and the commitment to that struggle. And in the example of the NEU and the NUT, quite successfully, by building that kind of pressure at a workplace level, they actually managed to retain the national pay scales in, I think, around 98% of workplaces that were covered by those, to the point where 10 years later, in 2023, the government once again started publishing national pay scales, because it realised that schools simply hadn't taken the so-called freedoms that they had to move away from. So it's one example of what we call renewal, but really the rest of the book then explores this process of what renewal might look like, what it did look like in the case of the NUT and then the NEU, and what lessons that might have for the union. So we start in chapter 4, we look at what was often termed within the NUT the turn to schools, a refocus on the workplace, the rebuilding up of the role of the workplace rep, and the importance of that right at the heart of union organising. And we talk about this an awful lot in the movement, about the importance of the workplace, about how the reps are the most important people in the union, etc., etc. But when we look at our union structures, when we look at how they operate, too often they don't put that into practice. So if you like, the first lesson that comes out of the book is that the union's in the workplace, not in headquarters. That actually it's that work done by workplace groups that is right at the core of what the union means. And every other part of the union, from local officials to the national executive, are adjunct to that key work of those workplace collectives. But the NUT and NNEU's workplace renewal projects, while successful in a number of specific cases, were really hard to scale across the country, and something was definitely missing in terms of that development of workplace-based organising. So in chapter 5, we look at how the union attempted to go beyond just its workplace organising and start to tackle the questions of organising for what purpose, organising in what context, and started to move into campaigning work that went beyond the purely industrial and the purely economic. So the most exciting examples of workplace organising showed massive increases in confidence, in consciousness amongst members, and a huge decline in the amount of casework and other things coming out. But they never connected politically with some of the biggest issues that we faced. I'll give one example here. The most intractable issue for teachers was, and always has been, or has been for the period that we study, the question of workload. Pay, absolutely high on the agenda, but the question of workload was always greater. And yet workload has some really, really significant drivers. Within the compulsory education sector in England, the drivers are Ofsted, primary testing, the excessive focus on exams, on data. Now, all of those things, you can build the strongest workplace group you possibly can, but the solutions to those questions come at a national level, and they're political decisions. Of course, under UK labour law, we're not allowed to take strike action over political questions. We're not allowed, it's not a legitimate trade dispute. We're not allowed to take the focused collective power of the union and apply that to those political questions. However, what the union sought was to connect its industrial campaigns, to politicize them increasingly, and to connect them to those political questions, and to get almost below that to the deeper level of ideology, so that it started taking on the government over questions like testing, over questions like Ofsted, but also over questions like child poverty and the nature of society. It then started to connect this with deeper political education work within the workplace groups, within the branches, so that it was connecting up, if you like, that kind of industrial workplace organising with a deeper understanding of why these questions arise. What was the process that was fragmenting our schools? It wasn't just that your head teacher had suddenly decided that they couldn't afford to pay people their progression this year. There was a wider context of the underfunding of schools, and we connected that to the question of what we call, in the words of the book that Stuart showed earlier, the global education reform movement, or the germ, identified by Pasi Sahlberg, a Finnish educator. Effectively, the application of neoliberal ideas to the education system. We started a program of developing education around this for our workplace reps. We made it core to our workplace reps education program, that they understood not just how to carry out the role of the rep, but the context in which they were doing it. What was the purpose? What were they organizing people to push back against? How did it all connect up? However, again, we look at the end of that chapter. When you look pre-pandemic at the industrial organizing work that the union was doing very successfully in a number of key areas, but that it hadn't managed to scale to a national level, and the political campaigning work, which it was really trying to push down to grassroots level, but hadn't quite managed to. The political campaigns work still existed mainly at a national level, mainly at a governmental level and in head office. And then suddenly we hit the pandemic, and chapter 6 of the book looks at that experience of the pandemic, because there was a step change there. And I think there was, for many unions, the external context forces that change of the pandemic. But I think it had different impacts on different unions. Some saw a drop in membership. The NEU during the period of the pandemic gained 55,000 new members and 4,500 new workplace reps. 7 in 10 of those were women, and a number of Black and LGBT plus reps doubled across the union. So huge, significant impact. So we tried to look at how that had come about, and we interviewed a large number of workplace reps, local secretaries, looking at what their experience had been during the pandemic. And essentially, what we saw was that the decade of work that had been put into workplace organizing, and the kind of 5 years of developing the political campaigns that had been built on top of that, really came together in the period of pandemic through the impact of leadership at different levels in the union. And we started to explore this process of what were workplace leaders doing that really connected that up and embedded it. What were what we call the intermediate leaders, those people between the workplace and the national union leadership, their local secretaries, the area reps. What were they doing that was connecting that process up, and where was it most successful? And this, for me, was a particularly interesting bit of it, because I think we talk more maybe in the trade union movement about leadership now through some of the new organizing programs, initiatives that come up, but still we're very much focused, I think, on how to identify workplace leaders and how to bring them onto our campaigns, when actually what we realized was where the organizing had been most successful, where the union was strongest, there was actually a process of developing and building leadership, not just identifying leaders, but building and developing leadership. So we started to explore what that leadership would look like, and identified sort of 3 key aspects that came across where the union was strongest and best organized. And those we term the first one strategic leadership, and it's often what people traditionally think of as leadership. It was about coming up with successful strategy, successful tactics, knowing the timing, when to push, knowing the ground and the context. And that often meant that leadership had to be really, really embedded in the workforce. The union had had a massive shift from local secretaries who would cover a whole local authority area, maybe with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 members in it, who used to carry out all of the casework, be involved in solving all the issues, etc. A massive shift from that to workplace reps taking this on, partly because the fragmentation of the system forced it. As I said, it forced that process where a single secretary that used to negotiate with one local authority employer suddenly had 200, 300 separate employers to negotiate with. That provided an opportunity to develop leadership, because it became necessary. Suddenly those workplace leaders had to be doing the negotiating, had to be doing the organizing, had to connect all of those parts together. And when that opportunity was taken, it's really successful. So developing that strategic leadership was a really key element. And of course, those workplace leaders, being closer to the ground, had greater access to knowledge, and to be honest, were better at resolving issues because they were embedded in them than someone external would have been. The second type of leadership we looked at, which was very much developed during this period, is what we call critical leadership, which was about posing a critique to the existing system, the existing state of affairs. And there were 3 key elements within that: being able to develop a critique of society as it is, being able to pose an alternative vision of society as it could be, and then linking those to a belief in the power of collective action and collective organising to change things from one to the other. And that has also been turned into work Howard's done, organising around ideas, which is a concept I really like. The fact that the ideas themselves became crucial, that critique of society and connecting it to an alternative vision of what things could look like was absolutely crucial in inspiring and developing people, taking them from the point where an issue like workload or testing or Ofsted was seen in isolation as a single problem, to an understanding of where these things came from, a neoliberal view of education as a commodity, as something where essentially parents were consumers trying to choose the best school, and you needed consumer data in order to do that. Once people understood that picture, the vision that was promoted by government, by the academy chains, etc., they were much more able not only to fight it, but to mobilize others in the fight against what was happening and to maintain their confidence even in the face of setbacks. They understood the power of what they were struggling against and the importance of keeping that struggle up. So that critical leadership, again, was absolutely key. But the third area of leadership we identified was, the third aspect of leadership was what we termed educative leadership, which for those who are educators draws very much on Vygotsky's ideas of education and zone of proximal development, the idea of working alongside someone in order to develop your skills, what you can do with the support of a more capable or more experienced peer. And we saw this was the rarest, we saw it in the fewest number of cases, but where the union was really effective, leaders were in place who, in the words of one rep, their style is that they don't swoop in and do it for you. They swoop in and support you to resolve the problems. That was a rep describing what they felt, and our interview suggested was a very effective local secretary who had built this approach where she saw herself as a big sister to the workplace reps, and that she was there to support them to develop their skills in resolving the problem, not as was often termed by others, the kind of white knight in shining armor who would come along and resolve the problems and ride off again into the sunset. So this educative leadership was really key to that process of renewing leadership throughout the union structures. So those were the key lessons we took out from the book, that the union's in the workplace, and that's where we need to be organising, that organising needs to be political. You can't just act at the level of the industrial, you have to focus on the political, the ideological as well, and connect them all up. And thirdly, that leadership matters. Those are the ideas we explore in the book. And I guess the final and most significant conclusion, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, if leadership matters, and in particular that intermediate layer of leadership, which again, we identify within the union was the weakest. The workplace leadership had been really developed through these programs, and the national leadership had a clear idea and direction of where it was going. But the intermediate leadership was really patchy. And I think that's true across a lot of the movement, that organising has focused very much on the workplace and not developed what flows out of that, not connected people together beyond the workplace. So we end the book with a call to build that layer of intermediate leadership, if you like, a new shop stewards movement like they had at the end of the First World War, or like the movement that was built around the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions in the 60s and 70s, a movement of workplace reps and those people acting beyond the workplace but connected together across the trade union movement to help build leadership at all levels in the movement to take us forward. So there's some thoughts to get us started in a bit of a discussion, but I'm really interested in your thoughts, maybe how that relates to your experience of UCU, and whether you think there's anything that's useful from what I've said in what you're doing, but also if you've got useful lessons that we could take back into that process of discussing how we build a labour movement that can truly respond to the challenges ahead. And I'll end on this note. I am fundamentally hugely optimistic about this, and hugely filled with that hope that Stuart referred to at the beginning, because the fact is that in spite of all of that context, in spite of all of the attacks on it, the story we tell is of a union that was growing, that was deepening its connection with members, and that was securing victories in its fight to protect the education system and to change the society that we live in. And if we can build that across the trade union movement, then absolutely we can win.
Yeah, I mean, I've got loads of notes here. It's just really inspiring. So does anybody have any direct questions or any comments, brief comments they want to make to go on based on what was said? Yeah, Kat, when you go.
Super. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with maybe a kind of perhaps basic one. I think I might know an answer, but I'd be really interested to know your answer. So I read a statistic the other day that in the teaching profession, something like 90% of teachers are unionised, whereas in higher education, I think 30% of us are unionised. And I was wondering what your kind of perspective is on why that might be the case. Is there a kind of material explanation, but maybe there's also something kind of cultural going on? Because that seems like one of the kind of real first hurdles that we have in kind of post-16 education to get over.
I think it's really significant. Density has traditionally been very high in compulsory education, 90% and above. During the period we studied, there were some serious attacks on it. So why has it been so high? There's a combination of different factors, I think. So one of them, and the common belief when the organising projects in the NEU started in 2008 to 2010, the common belief was that density was so high because people joined the union as insurance against a false allegation being made against them by a child. So there was a significant belief in the fact that actually it was essentially legal protection and a service, and that was what most teachers were looking for. When the government began its assault on the education unions in earnest around 2010, one of the things it tried out was launching a non-union to represent teachers. It launched an organisation called EDAPT. Well, it says it wasn't launched by the government. It was launched by some teachers who were fed up with their politicised unions, but clearly launched with a lot of support from government. And I think one of them was even a friend of Michael Gove's. But when they launched that attack, the EDAPT started by commissioning a survey to ask people why they joined teacher unions and publishing the results. And this proved to be a massive mistake for them, because 80% of the people they surveyed listed amongst their top reasons that they joined for collective representation in issues of pay and terms and conditions, which was a real surprise even to those of us in the education trade union movement who hadn't commissioned that research and frankly thought that it might not be the case. So there was a significant process of trying to shift a very passive membership, 90% density, but with very little activity or connection to the union, into a membership that was much more connected, active, and saw the union as its own. But definitely beginning from that level of density is a massive asset, even if it does have its own challenges. The later attacks on the density in compulsory education were focused around changing routes into education. So the shift from a university-based teacher training route into on-the-job training schemes, into Teach First, into RTPs, GTPs, the whole shift into schools directs and to basically training in an apprenticeship model on the job. Part of that was definitely an attack on the role of teacher unions, which recruited primarily through the universities, and it put significant pressure on, because workplace reps at the beginning of the organising project weren't used to the idea that you recruited people in the workplace, because they all came to you as members, they'd all joined up when they were training at university. So there's definitely significant challenge there. Flipping on to UCU and its much lower density in higher education, I think there's something else in the story that we talk about that may be relevant, and it's around this idea of building collective culture in the workplace. So one of the things we saw that had been stripped away and we were trying to rebuild through the project was this idea that actually a collective culture where people see problems as something you address as a workplace group together, not looking for outside support from the union as a third party, but you're building that in the workplace, was absolutely crucial to success. And even on a small scale, even with much lower density, starting to build that collective culture amongst workers, union members, and those outside of the union, to begin to rebuild that, I think is part of the key to increasing density in other sectors. We're facing massive challenges in that so many of the key levers for collective culture have been stripped out from society. The destruction of council housing, the destruction of much of what we own in common and socially. But nevertheless, I believe that culture can be rebuilt, and it needs to be a key part of what we do as trade union activists.
That's great. I'm just maybe give our colleagues that are coming in online. Is there any questions that you want to put to them? We've only got about 5 minutes at this point.
So can I ask a follow-up, Gawain, about the amalgamation? I mean, I know you said because the NUT joined with another smaller union that represented a lot of support workers in schools to form the NEU, and that obviously increases your membership density in a very significant way, and that's the other element in higher education, that we have different unions representing different grades of workers, so there's a divided workforce. So I know you said that this was another book project in itself, this kind of a story of a merger, but do you think that's been important in the impact of the NEU has had, and to break down, to say everybody in the workplace is in one union, and apart from the head teachers? I mean, so what's the significance of that in terms of collective culture, I would say?
Brilliant. I mean, it is another book, but I will attempt to address it briefly. It's something I'm really interested in. I was the chair of the NUT's Professional Unity Committee, which was responsible for its strategy of trying to bring together all of the education unions into a single union. And so I was directly involved in negotiating the amalgamation between NUT and ATL. Both were primarily teaching unions, in fact, so both mainly organised teachers. Classroom teachers are mainly split in England between 3 unions: the NUT, which is the largest, the NASUWT slightly smaller, and the ATL smaller than that again. The ATL, and to an extent the NASUWT, had started to admit support staff members as well, but the NUT, the largest of the teaching unions, retained the old craft qualification. You had to have a teaching qualification to be a member of it. It wasn't an industrial-based union. It was specific to those with teaching qualifications. A number of us had tried to change that at conferences of the NUT, but unsuccessfully. And then in the process of the amalgamation with the ATL, it created a much larger union by bringing the two together. But it also meant you couldn't negotiate. Even those opposed to representing support staff in the NUT understood you couldn't bring together an amalgamation where you said, we want to amalgamate with one part of your union, but not the rest of it. So the membership regulations had to be changed to organise all those that work in education. And I think it had a significant impact. You mentioned head teachers. In fact, both the unions organised head teachers as well. And the NEU is the second largest of the head teacher unions after the NAHT. So it really is wall-to-wall organising everybody. I do think that is a massive strength. I think organising unions on an industrial basis, where everybody who is if you're in the workplace, you're in the union, is absolutely key. But we shouldn't romanticize where we've got to with that so far in compulsory education. The reality is that most support staff members in England and Wales are members of the recognised support staff unions, Unison, Unite, GMB. Those are the ones who negotiate their terms and conditions. So although there's a significant and growing support staff section of the National Education Union, the majority of support staff are still not in it. In fact, significant numbers of support staff are not in any union at all. So all of the unions have work to do to bring that together. And of course, it creates new challenges as well, because there's a completely logical reason why, if you were, take for example, Unison as a local government union, there's a completely logical reason why support staff who are employed on local government terms and conditions, and a significant section of your membership in that bargaining group, you would see as crucial to that bargaining group. You negotiate for them alongside other local government staff, and it's a single united bargaining group. You can see from the perspective of the National Education Union why everyone who works in a school should be organised in a single union. Because although they're on different terms and conditions, different negotiations, bringing them together in the workplace in solidarity is absolutely crucial. Both unions have a logical case for why they need to be organising those members and build unity. So at some point, and I say this now as in a sense, an impartial observer, because I'm not a member of, I'm not an active member of any U anymore. At some point, unions have to sit down and say, well, actually, if we all have legitimate claims on these members, let's work out a way in which we organise them together. Let's work out a way in which we have membership partnerships that work across unions, because the fact is we have to get out. If significant numbers of support staff aren't in a trade union at all, then I don't care who organises them. Let everybody organise them, but let's get them in a union and let's try and build that unity across the union. So I think that's absolutely crucial. And in fact, a good example of that was the NUT and UCU, which prior to the amalgamation, if you go back to the past, had a partnership agreement where if you were a UCU member and you ended up moving into compulsory education, you retained your UCU membership, but you were organised by the NUT. And similarly, if you were a teacher and NUT member and you ended up in further or higher education, you kept your NUT membership, but your organising union was UCU and you were treated as a UCU member. More partnerships of that nature in the trade union movement, and more organising the unorganised rather than fighting over the people who are already organised, would be, I think, really a significant shift for the movement.
I mean, that's brilliant, and I'm just conscious you've got about 4 minutes to get that train. So we're going to talk.
I'm on the platform, so if it arrives, you'll just see my camera go off and me dive onto a train. But
Well, we didn't want you to miss another one. But if anything, what this done is a taster for why people would want to stay on for 9 o'clock and meet in the pub in person. That's great. Can I suggest then that we leave kind of Gawain there and just being ready to catch his train and open up the discussion? So, I think the plan was always once Gawain, if he was here, he would have kind of made a contribution, and then Sophia has done a bit of work to kind of make a response, if you like, and that hopefully will kind of open up the discussion. And we'll go through till 8 o'clock if that's okay. So is that okay? People happy to go forward in that? So if I make a contribution, then we can all kind of jump in and hopefully begin to maybe even towards the end think about what do we need to do from here to kind of build on what we've done, because it strikes me that it would take ages to unpack what Gawain had to kind of give and the lessons that are in the book. So if that's okay, then Sophia, do you want to start off with your contribution, then we can see where we go from there?
So, thoroughly recommend this book to any trade unionist in education, particularly because there are so many lessons to for us to consider in higher education. And as Gawain said, it's not a prescriptive book. It's a book that describes the experience of what they did in the NU over a number of years, and then tries to draw out analytical lessons that then you could apply variously to other kinds of situations. So there are a couple of points that really resonated for me that I wanted to kind of highlight to you all. So they start from an analysis of teachers' work as a labour process, and I'll read from your book, that it's rooted, their analysis is rooted in our analysis of teachers' work as a labour process in which teachers as workers are engaged in a struggle with employers for control of the work itself, the form and content of the work, how the work is evaluated and rewarded, and who gets to decide these issues. So we can see there this idea that at the heart is the labour process. Now, that is not just solely about, as he said, terms and conditions. It's also about the fundamental question of autonomy and the way autonomy, but autonomy exercised in a collective setting of the workplace, where we decide as an academic community say, how our work should be done, and how we evaluate our own work. And I mean, we can all think about how those that kind of autonomy has been eroded in the university. And this is not just for academic or teaching members of staff, it's also for professional services members of staff, in that the work is increasingly manager-led, micromanaged. I mean, I recall we used to have, for example, departmental secretaries who would be in their posts for 20 years, and they got to know all the academic staff. They knew all the students. They could advise people. They had a kind of they had an important position as in our institutions, and a memory also that was critical to the work of academics. So the mission of the university. So we can think about how those roles have also declined and become sort of more subject to managerial control and metrics through as well as all this computerization and IT. So that was one sort of question that really struck me, and starting from thinking about ourselves as workers and control over our work and control over that.
So can I just check to make sure our online colleague can hear?
While it is part of UCU's mission to talk about academic autonomy, our role in self-governance, it isn't part of the kind of day-to-day conversation. And in a way, what the NEU has done in politicizing these questions is really connect this broader neoliberal project, as Gawain was saying, connect a critique of that to how the labour process really works, and what that autonomy means and implies in terms of the role, our role in society, and our role in relation to the communities we're part of, and so on. That is like kind of easier for teachers in that their workplace is in a community of people who send their children to that school, so the kind of connections are clearer, and that's obviously more tricky for us in the university, where people think of us as being remote and in the ivory tower and all of that. So but there are ways in which thinking about that is really important. So another thing that Gawain mentioned, and which is a key element in the book, is a kind of analysis of the forces that have impacted that labour process and that erosion of autonomy in a very systematic way. I'm not sure if you caught it, but they call it there's this global education reform movement, or GERM for short, right? I wished we had something like that in UCU, that we could, some sort of acronym of a term to help our members understand the character of this beast that we're facing and how it impacts on our labour process and on our autonomy. So that connection between that broader historical, social, political environment and how it impacts on us, that was obviously very critical to developing the kinds of approaches they came up with. Another, I guess this is more of a question for us to perhaps think about and discuss. You heard Gawain talking about the importance of the workplace rep, right? So this is somebody who is in the in a school, presumably. I have no idea whether you'd have just one for a whole school or and you know, schools are of varying size. Does it matter? So I was thinking about the logistics of our branch in particular, that we have, you know, 3,000 members, not all of them that in the branch, in that some are retired, but the 3,000 includes a lot of people who are in our branch, and we're trying to often at branch committee think about how do we organize. Are we organizing workplaces really? I mean, not really. It's kind of the local contacts who do that. So how do we have enough? It made me ask the question, how do we develop that understanding of the conditions of our labour process on the ground, and connect with those concerns in a very real way that actually makes the union relevant in the day-to-day of people's working lives. So how that's a question for us that I felt the book raised. How do we do that? What would be the mechanisms of renewal in our union? Because I mean, as a branch co-president, you know, we're constantly being asked, oh, could you do this? Could you do that? And understandably, but at the same time, it's often these are not really things we can do, and we don't necessarily have enough understanding, either capacity or understanding, if there are very specific conditions of work in that particular unit in a very large university, because we do know that actually conditions vary. I mean, there are some general. That's one thing I've really learned from being in this role for a while, that conditions vary quite a lot. Managers think of the university policies in quite different ways. And just a really important example is a question we've been working on for a long time, which is that all guaranteed hours staff should receive paid training for the work that they do. So they are equipped, they're paid to get the skills that they need to do their jobs. But there are some places in the university that don't have any training, more or less. They may have an induction. So how do we address that sort of disconnect between, like, the school Kat and I am in has, because of the struggle in the workplace by people on the ground to say, you've said we are entitled to paid training, so where is it? You're asking me to do this, but where is my paid training? Now, the guaranteed hours tutors in our school have 18 hours a year per semester of paid training, right? Which is great, but it's been a struggle, actually not at branch level, but in the school to get that, and required a lot of direct action, actually, not representations from the branch. So it the book made me think about what are we doing at the workplace level. You know, the local contacts are sort of connecting to members and feeding into branch work. But what are we doing to support that kind of level of workplace organising was the real question for me. And would that not sort of change the dynamics if we actually had we had people being not just a contact but a rep, and maybe more than one in a workplace. So I mean, those were the two big sort of points for me around autonomy and around the role of workplace reps. And there's lots more to say. Those were the main sort of lessons I took away from the book.
Okay, I think maybe then I'll take the last word. That's okay, because it is 8 o'clock now. Our online colleagues, are you happy with that as a kind of conclusion? And Gawain, you're hopefully hearing us, but you're catching us all the time. So, I mean, really all that's left for me to say is to thank Gawain for making that contribution despite the kind of adverse circumstances.
Yeah.
And maybe we should kind of just give the traditional round of applause to thank you context for the meeting. And